And now, please welcome to the stage, from Deloitte, Alex Glowacki.
Hello, hello. Thanks for joining. So we're going to do a deep dive into log collection today. So excited to walk through some different frameworks and architectures for security operations. For a quick agenda, I'll introduce myself, we'll give a brief overview, figure out why it's important, what ways we want to transfer data between applications, and a high-level framework on what you need to do and how to follow it. Couple brief examples of architectures that I would recommend, and then we could summarize some key points and go into some Q&A if we have some extra time. So a little bit about myself. I'm Alex Glowacki. I'm a senior consultant at Deloitte. I specialize in Google SecOps, that's SIEM and SOAR, as well as Google Cloud Security and ingestion architecture specifically. For the last 7 years, I've been developing and designing ingestion architectures for large corporations, and I've been making sure that all of their data gets to a centralized location so that they could be comprehensive to either detect or aggregate upon. So, security log collection, right? What's our objective? We want to architect a flexible solution to take data from point A to point B, make sure that it's normalized, as well as we could accommodate for any organizational change that might occur. So what would be some of our goals, right? In terms of security, we want to figure out some baseline log sources. Think about your network devices, think about your endpoints, think about your cloud services, identity access management. We want to make sure we figure out any baseline visibility opportunities so we could create detections off of that, as well as respond accordingly. In terms of organizing your logs, you want to prioritize taking logs into a central aggregate layer so that you could have one input stream and have multiple output streams under one cost. You also want to standardize how you take your logs from point A to point B to make sure that you don't have too much of a mixed bag and you could follow a certain process. The last thing I want to call out is having a common schema. This is very important in terms of aggregating and detecting across applications due to the fact that everyone could have their own schema from their application, but you really want to centralize that so your team is focused on one set of data points. So what are some common challenges, right? First one, no common schema. Would be pretty bad if you're looking for a source IP and you just typed it in correctly because it was actually SRC IP, right? Like, you don't want that. We want to make sure that our schema is all the same, make sure we could compare from one log source to another log source. Sometimes data is dirty, right? Your raw log is not expected to what you want it to be. And what you need to do is you need to focus on pre-processing that data to make sure that you can have it go to your destination accordingly and the way that you expect it. There are also some unconventional logging pipelines, right? Maybe there was some side project from one team and it turned into a production project overnight and no one changed or updated that tech debt to go into a standardized production application. Other than that, I've definitely seen certain organizations have an unmanaged fleet of devices or infrastructure. So let's say we needed to make a schema change or a configuration change across 1,000 devices. There's actually sometimes people going hands-on keyboard, one computer at a time to update 1,000 accordingly. We don't want that. We want to focus to have an entire fleet to be managed. Other than that, for temporary fixes and or solutions, that's where tech debt gets created, never gets visited again. Sometimes people are scared to touch it because someone else built it and they left the firm or company. We want to avoid that at all costs. Other than that, sometimes organizations are not focused on a centralized logging location. Maybe they have a log source going from point A to point B and it doesn't allow dual feeding, which that prevents your organization from using that application accordingly. And sometimes you see some direct logging implementations where unless you touch it, suddenly a lot of changes are required and a lot of permissions across different leaders. And sometimes you don't want to go through that change management process. So why is that important, right? Just for our first bullet, right? For security applications, enabling that correlation between security events across multiple products is super important. If you have a mixed bag of devices, applications, security telemetry, you want to make sure that it's organized in a way that you could aggregate on the data as well as detect on the data. Now, if we're looking something to be a little bit more forward-looking, think about machine learning. You need to have a common schema to correlate between different data points so that you could collect that and aggregate and create calculations off of that. Once you enable that, you could start focusing on more complex and higher efficacy use cases. Once you do have a centralized logging solution and the ability to have multiple outputs, this enables you to not disrupt your security operations because you're able to share that data across multiple teams around your organization. So that type of change management allows you to provide more visibility to different teams without disrupting what your security operations are. Outside of that, you start to create different variable tuning knobs. So you could start reducing noise, reducing different data in different phases of your logging pipeline. So maybe in a certain portion, you're pre-processing some data for a particular application. There is no dependency as long as you focused on getting the raw data into a centralized point. From there, if you have everything standardized, this lowers your risk of production changes. There have been, in many cases, an organization requests a change across their entire infrastructure, and that is a huge risk. However, if you've built and standardized your logging pipeline, a change like that could be a quick update to a GitHub with your CI/CD pipeline, and then it just pushes the change out within 30 minutes, instead of focusing on something that could be days, weeks, or months for a change. The last thing to call out here is just having a standardized approach. If someone asks you, how would you onboard a data source? How would you get this into your environment? You have a direct answer instead of asking and saying, it depends, which is the perfect consultant answer. So moving on. If we're talking about moving data from point A to point B, there are a number of ways to do that. However, I like to put this under a specific umbrella of either a push or pull method. So if we're looking at an agent collector, this is something where you're installing a piece of software on a device locally to read log files and pushing the data to a defined destination. If we're looking at something like a forwarder, a typical syslog forwarding infrastructure, this is listening on a TCP IP address, as well as being able to push to the destination that's defined. Now, as more SaaS products are in the environment, API methods of ingestion are becoming more prevalent, which allows two different approaches. So you could create a custom script, or sometimes you have a native integration where you could just provide a destination and it just sends to potentially a cloud storage bucket where your application could read from, or you could send directly to the destination you've defined. Webhook is also an alternative. It's pretty lightweight. You set up a predefined URL and you're able to make sure your data gets pushed to the defined destination. And I did mention cloud storage, but this is a nice intermediary for multiple applications as long as you have good role-based access control and permission requirements. So let's look at a high-level framework. If we're going at the very basic top level, think of log sources to a centralized logging pipeline destination that splits off to multiple destinations. What I recommend is a cold storage option. So depending on your compliance requirements, retention policy requirements, just send it off your raw data telemetry to cold storage right away, set it and forget it. In terms of your SIM data lake functionality, definitely recommend sending that directly from the centralized logging pipeline or an intermediary layer, as we'll talk here shortly. Also, providing the opportunity for non-security teams is a big shift that not many organizations are taking today. There have been many instances that Data is very important, very expensive. However, if you're disrupting security operations, no one wants to share the data. But if you have an easy way to divert and send the data based off a request, depending on the team's requirements, then you're not disrupting any data flow, you're not interrupting any data flow or any ways to disrupt day-to-day operations. And lastly, for your SOAR, you want to collect that data and automate any responses. So in terms of an incident, in terms of a detection, you want to have some sort of playbook to react and respond and make sure that it gets handled accordingly. So if we're looking at some products and some examples, here's an example of a few log sources that you might expect in your environment. The goal would be to use something like a Cribble stream to collect at a centralized location and then have Cribble stream sent to multiple destinations, which in this case would be cold storage and Google SecOps. Palo Alto XSOAR is being used here as a SOAR, which is showcasing you don't have to jump into one vendor, one product. You can have a mixed bag. You can pick the solutions that you want and that you prefer. The idea here is to make sure that this flow of data is consistent and you follow your process accordingly. However, unfortunately, that's a perfect world. And when we go into an organization, it's never the case. We got to think about cost implications, think about dependencies, got to think about tech debt. So this is something that would be a little bit more realistic when you go into a security organization. So one of the callouts here is if we're using Google SecOps, they do have a cloud feed integration. Think of that as our cloud storage approach or our API pull approach that's native to Google SecOps. In this case, it wouldn't make sense to send CrowdStrike Falcon alerts to Cribble unless you needed that into multiple applications. Even if you do need to do that, it's a very easy configuration change, but we do want those alerts in Google SecOps because we'll be creating pass-through alerts in that application. For Office 365, again, very easy integration with Google SecOps. So you might be going with this approach for a quick win due to the fact that no other application or team is using Office 365, and it might not make sense to use up your throughput licensing agreement for Cribble Stream. However, what's really good here is standing up forwarding infrastructure leveraging Cribble Stream. If you do not go that route, you would have to stand up some sort of collector, some sort of forwarder to get from your Palo Alto devices to your destination. And lastly, for GCP audit logging, why not use the native tool sets, the native cloud provider to ingest data? You save money and it's a direct integration, so you might as well use the best approach to collect that data. The other thing here is those are just one set of products that might be my recommendation, but not everyone could shift on a dime or invest into the next generation of technology, and they need to get by with what they have today. So this is another approach where you're subscribing to Kafka clusters and Kafka topics. The idea here is you're sending data still to a centralized location, and you're normalizing the data using either Logstash VMs. On the previous slide, Google SecOps had native parsing in the product. So you're leaning towards the features and benefits of the product and where you need to go to cover off on the goals for your security log collection. In this case, 3 different Kafka topics for our 3 different log sources. We have Logstash VMs doing normalization to our common schema, and then we're sending it off to Elasticsearch for searching and detection, or even cold storage, just like the other slide. It's still following our high-level framework, and we're still making sure that the flow is consistent, standardized, even though we're using different products. So after those examples, I want you to walk away with a couple of things today. First one, every organization is different. You have to be flexible and adapt to the business. So depending on the organization dependencies, any exceptions, you have to be flexible and agile in order to accommodate and make sure you're still following your framework. Next thing is, I really want to call this one out, is prioritizing single in, multi-out centralized logging pipeline. It is such a huge benefit to say, oh, we got a new log source, we get it to this destination, but we need to send it 3 different places. Sure, couple of buttons because you already configured the output destination and you're done. Let's say you already have logs going into your centralized logging platform and someone requests that they need to integrate with it. It's a simple configuration change instead of going through a deep dive of how do we re-architect this entire solution. Next is common schema. I call this out a few times. This is a dependency in order to do any sort of machine learning analytics, any sort of detection capabilities at a next level. Our use cases are becoming far more advanced. They're no longer just a quick pattern and a detect. It's long periodic detections. It's something that you need to do in your environment. And if you don't, then if someone asks, hey, are you able to do machine learning detections? You have to say no, because you can't compare across multiple log sources. And lastly, it's going to benefit everyone and your entire team that you have a managed fleet of infrastructure. So if someone requests a change or even an incident occurs and you need to reach out to the team owner or contain the blast radius, having that all managed will be easily to reduce the impact as well as making a change upon request. So I did end a little bit early than I would like, which is good. We have about 3 minutes. I did want to open it up for Q&A. If there is anyone from the crowd from a question, I'm happy to answer it. If some of the folks are shy, I'll be at the Deloitte booth right after this talk, so happy to answer anything right now.
Do you have a recommended schema that you would point people to implement in their sims? There's a couple out there that are open.
Sure. So the question was, do I have a recommended schema? Again, consultant answer depends on what products you're using, right? If you're using Google SecOps, they force you into a unified data model. However, if you're starting to use Splunk or Elasticsearch has Elastic Common Schema. That's another approach. However, in all cases, whatever your detecting application is, you want to focus that you normalize the data to that. So I'm not going to suggest a schema per se, but you should focus on the products that you're using in your environment and make sure that you do it up front, because some products allow it to be optional. And what I've seen in the environment is, let's get the data in there, let's migrate, let's finish, and then no one changes to the common schema because no one wants to do that additional work. And they just check the box off of saying, data's in there, we got use cases on it, but then you can't further and create those complex use cases unless you do that work. So the one great thing that some people complain about for Google SecOps is that they force you to UDM, but it's like doing your homework right away instead of just procrastinating on it. So that's what I would recommend.
As far as open source, solutions, like Grafana, and I can't remember the Velociraptor, stuff like that. That's open source. What kind of steps do you have to address those challenges of trying to get those logs into your traditional SIM?
Yeah, good question. So question was for not as prevalent log sources by vendors that are more open source, how do you ingest those? I think in all cases, anything that isn't as popular will require some custom activity, some custom level of effort. So the idea here is to follow the framework, find the best approach to get it to your centralized logging platform, and have your centralized logging platform get it to your SIM agnostic or multi-out destination. So if you could get it to your centralized logging platform, then you don't have to worry about getting it to your SIM because that's already configured. However, if it's a situation where maybe based off cost or based off of any business requirements that doesn't allow you to go to your centralized logging platform, I would recommend covering off on one of the 5 data transfer methods and then making sure that you're able to normalize the data so it could be detected upon it. And I think that's it for today. So thanks for joining. Really appreciate the time.